stop so much as surrender. It was a long, slow exhalation of steam and exhaustion, a final metallic sigh that shuddered through every coupling and carriage before settling into a profound, echoing silence. Inside the 41st car, a sealed boxcar that had smelled of fear, sweat, and stale bread for 10 days, the silence was even deeper. Feldwebel Klaus Vogel blinked in the sudden stillness, his ears ringing after the constant, rhythmic clatter of wheels on track. He could feel the profound weight of the continent beneath him, a vast, unbroken mass that seemed to press up against the floorboards. America. The word had been an abstraction, a place in propaganda films, a land of fat capitalists and skyscrapers, of decadence and weakness. It was the enemy, yes, but a distant, almost theoretical one. Now, it was the air he was about to breathe. The heavy door slid open with a shriek of protesting metal. Not the gentle, manual motion of a European station, but a violent, mechanical scraping, powered by some unseen, indifferent force. Daylight, real daylight, not the slivers through ventilation grates, flooded in. It was a different light. Cleaner, sharper, harsher. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the car and the pale, drawn faces of the 80 men packed inside. A voice barked in heavily accented German. Raus! Alle raus! Schnell! Out! Everyone out! Fast! Klaus shuffled forward with the others, his legs stiff, his body aching from the journey. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had seen the frozen hell outside Moscow and the grinding meat grinder of Kursk. He had faced T-34s that kept coming even when they were on fire. He had endured temperatures that cracked rifle stocks. He thought he had seen scale. He thought he understood industrial power. He stepped down from the boxcar, his boots hitting not a platform of stone or wood, but a surface of perfect, seamless concrete that stretched away in every direction as far as the eye could see. It was this concrete that delivered the first, visceral shock. It wasn't a road. It wasn't a square. It was a plain. A manufactured, grey desert. Dozens of parallel railway tracks, like the strings of some titanic instrument, ran across it, vanishing into a heat haze in the distance. On them sat not trains, but chains of trains, hundreds of cars long, all perfectly aligned. Freight cars, boxcars, tankers, in an unbroken stream of olive drab and rust red. The scale was incomprehensible. In Germany, a train of 50 cars was a major logistical event. Here, it was a unit of measurement. The air hummed, not with the chirping of birds or the murmur of a town, but with a deep, industrial bass note, the sound of machines breathing. American soldiers in crisp, clean uniforms, not the mud-spattered Feldgrau Klaus was used to, moved among them, herding the ragged column of prisoners. These guards didn't look hateful. They looked bored. They carried their rifles with a casual ownership that was more unnerving than aggression. They had the well-fed, confident bearing of men who had never known a calorie deficit, whose homeland had never heard a bomber's siren. Klaus fell into line, his eyes trying to take it all in. They were marched not toward a grim fortress or a barbed wire enclosure in some desolate field, but towards a fleet of trucks. The trucks themselves were a shock. They were huge, slab-sided, and gleaming under the sun. They looked new. Every single one of them. In Russia, a working truck was a treasure, cannibalized from 3 wrecks, held together with hope and wire. Here, they were disposable, abundant. The prisoners were loaded in, the tailgates clanging shut. The convoy moved. And America unfolded. They left the rail yard, a place that could have swallowed Berlin's entire Hauptbahnhof, and entered a landscape that broke Klaus's understanding of the world. The road was not a path through the countryside, it was a ruler straight gash of perfect, black asphalt, 4 lanes wide, divided by grass. It went from horizon to horizon without a curve, without a pothole. It was so wide it seemed wasteful. Along it, not in towns or villages, but standing alone in vast fields, were factories. But they were not the soot-stained, multi-story brick hives of the Ruhr Valley. These were low, sprawling complexes of glass and steel, acres and acres under a single, Continuous roof. They had no character, no history. They were pure function. And they were surrounded not by tenements, but by endless parking lots filled with thousands upon thousands of cars. Cars. For workers. Private automobiles, in numbers that made the mind reel. In Hamburg before the war, his father, a shipyard foreman, had dreamed of one day owning a Volkswagen. Here, it looked like every janitor and secretary drove one. The prisoners, pressed against the slat sides of the truck, were silent. The scale of it was a physical pressure. It wasn't just wealth. It was a different relationship with matter, with space, with energy. Germany had been a nation straining every muscle, recycling every scrap, fighting for its life with frantic, ingenious scarcity. This was a land of obscene, tranquil abundance. It didn't fight for its life, it casually, effortlessly produced. The war, for this place, was not a total, existential struggle consuming the homeland. It was a production line in a distant wing of an endless factory. The realization was a cold knife in Klaus's gut. They had been fighting this. This. How could you fight a geometry? How could you bleed an equation? They drove for hours. The landscape refused to cohere into a familiar picture. There were no crumbling walls, no bombed-out shells of buildings, no fields pockmarked by shell craters or scarred by tank treads. The earth was neat, tamed, partitioned into colossal squares of crops, each one a perfect monochrome of green or brown. The farmhouses were not quaint, half-timbered huts clustered in villages for protection. They were isolated palaces of white wood, set far back from the road, each with its own silver water tower and a cluster of outbuildings that looked larger than most German barns. There was no defensive posture to anything. It was all open, sprawling, confident. Vulnerable. And yet, that very vulnerability was its power. No one here had even considered needing to be defensible. The sun was lowering when they reached the camp. It was not what they expected. There were no watchtowers with machine guns. No double fences of razor wire. It was a neat grid of low, white-painted barracks set on a manicured expanse of grass, more like a military cantonment than a prison. The sign at the gate said, Camp Herne, PW Camp. PW. Prisoner of war. The term was bureaucratic, clean. It held none of the grim finality of Kriegsgefangenenlager. They were processed in an orderly building that smelled of fresh paint and disinfectant. They were stripped, deluged in showers with a shocking, endless torrent of hot water. And issued uniforms. Not the ragged remnants of their Wehrmacht field gray, but new, sturdy denim work clothes, dyed a deep blue, with PW stenciled in large white letters on the back and legs. The clothes were coarse, but they were whole. They were given blankets, a mess kit, a towel. The efficiency was stunning, impersonal, and utterly thorough. A medical officer, a young American captain who spoke serviceable German, examined them. He listened to Klaus's heart, checked his eyes, noted the old shrapnel scars on his shoulder from outside Kharkov with a clinical detachment. "You'll be fine," the doctor said, making a note. Next. There was no malice, no curiosity. It was a maintenance check on a piece of equipment. Assigned to Barrack 12, Klaus pushed open the door. The interior was flooded with the last of the evening light. It was a long, open room lined with simple cots, each with a mattress and 2 blankets. The floors were bare wood, swept clean. Windows lined both walls. It was austere, but it was dry, it was warm, and it was not a hole in the ground on the Russian steppe. The men filed in, the silence finally breaking into a low murmur of disbelief. A young private, barely 18, named Weber, sat heavily on his cot, running his hand over the blanket. "It's wool," he whispered, as if confessing a sin. That first meal was a religious experience. They were marched to a mess hall, a cavernous building filled with long tables. They were raised and filed past serving counters. Klaus watched as an American cook, a large black man in a pristine apron, slopped food onto each plate with the bored rhythm. Stew. Thick, meaty stew, with actual chunks of beef and potatoes. Bread. Not the hard, sawdust commissbrat of the Eastern Front, but soft, white, fresh bread. Butter. Real butter, a pale yellow pat. And coffee. Not ersatz made from roasted acorns, but real, bitter, fragrant coffee. Klaus sat down, staring at the tray. The smell alone was making him lightheaded. He took a bite of the stew. The flavor was so rich, so unambiguously good, that for a moment he thought he might be sick. He looked around. Some of the men were eating with frantic, animal haste, tears streaming down their faces. Others ate slowly, reverently, as if performing a sacrament. A Major Schneider, a haughty junker who had spent the journey lecturing on the weakness of American morale, sat utterly still, his spoon halfway to his mouth, his face a mask of profound cognitive dissonance. The enemy was feeding them better than the fatherland had fed its own front-line troops in years. The days settled into a surreal routine. Reveille was at 6 a.m., not with the barked command, but with the recorded bugle call over a loudspeaker system. They were expected to keep their barracks spotless. There were work details maintaining the campgrounds, repairing roads, some farm labor for local growers who paid the camp for the manpower. The work was not brutal. The guards were mostly older men or those deemed unfit for overseas service. They were not cruel. They were, if anything, indifferent. They called the prisoners krauts with a tone of casual familiarity, not hatred. They shared cigarettes, sometimes chocolate. They asked questions about Germany, not about the war, but about the country, the beer, the mountains, the cities. They showed photographs of their families, their homes, their cars. They spoke of rationing back in America as a minor inconvenience, a limit on sugar, on gasoline. They had no frame of reference for true scarcity. It was during a work detail at a local farm that Klaus experienced the second great shock. They were loading hay onto a truck. The farmer, a man in his 50s with a kind, weathered face, drove up not on a tractor, but in a personal pickup truck. He got out, nodded to the American guard, and then walked over to where Klaus and Weber were working. He looked at them for a long moment, then spoke in surprisingly decent German, learned, he said, from his grandparents. Hard work, he said, not unkindly. J.A., Klaus replied, wary. The farmer gestured to the vast fields around them, waving toward a complex of distant, shiny silos and long, low buildings. That's my place. My son and I run it. Used to have 10 hired men before the war. He looked at the two POWs, their PW markings stark on their backs. Now I have you boys. He didn't say it with resentment, but with a strange, pragmatic gratitude. You hungry? Marge packed some extra sandwiches. Before Klaus could process the offer, the farmer had walked back to his truck and returned with 2 thick sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, thick slices of ham, cheese, and lettuce on that impossibly soft white bread. He handed one to Klaus, one to Weber. Go on. You look like you could use it. Klaus took the sandwich. The guard, leaning against a fence post, saw the exchange and just gave a slow, lazy nod. Permission. No tension. Klaus took a bite. The farmer watched him, then said, almost to himself, hell of a thing, ain't it? You boys over there, shooting at my boy. My boys over there, shooting at you. And here we are, eating ham sandwiches in Texas. He shook his head, a profound sadness in his eyes that had nothing to do with hatred. Hell of a thing. That moment, more than the endless concrete or the mountains of food, shattered something in Klaus. The war was not a clash of ideologies here. It was a tragic, stupid interruption in the real business of life, which was growing food, building things, raising families. The farmer's enemy was not Klaus, the German soldier. His enemy was the war itself, which had taken his son and sent him these strange, hungry boys in denim as a replacement. The simplicity of it, the staggering, humane detachment from the hatred that had fueled the Eastern Front, left Klaus spiritually unmoored. Back in the camp, the shockwaves of America's reality were transforming the prisoners. The hardcore Nazis, the ones who still whispered about final victory and secret weapons, became isolated, shrill. Their rhetoric about inferior races and willpower seemed absurd in the face of the evidence. How could willpower compete with a warehouse full of bulldozers? How could racial purity matter to a country that built roads this wide? The belief system that had sent them to war, that had justified the unspeakable, began to crumble not under interrogation, but under the weight of a well-stocked PX. The camp had a small store where prisoners could buy cigarettes, soap, writing paper, and candy with canteen coupons they earned from work. The first time Klaus walked in, he simply stared. The shelves were full. Not selectively full, but overflowing. Bars of chocolate. Packets of gum. Safety razors. Socks. It was a trivial thing, a tiny store. But it was a microcosm. In Germany, even before the war, such a selection would have been a cause for celebration. Here, it was mundane. The sheer, unthinking availability of things was a constant, low-grade assault on his European sensibilities. Letters from home began to arrive, thin, fragile things written on the poorest quality paper, telling of bombing raids, of hunger, of trading family heirlooms for a sack of potatoes. Klaus would sit on his cot, reading his mother's desperate, brave words, and then look out the window at the boundless Texas sky, at the well-fed guards playing baseball, at the trucks rumbling by loaded with goods that had no destination but more abundance. The cognitive dissonance was agony. His loyalty, his love, was with the suffering, fragile world described in those letters. But his eyes, his stomach, his every waking moment testified to the overwhelming power of this new world. To love Germany was to love something broken, starving, and doomed. To acknowledge America's might was a betrayal that felt like a physical sickness. The emotional climax came not from a guard, but from a movie. The camp administration, as part of a re-education program, showed films in the mess hall twice a week. Not propaganda films, but American movies. Musicals, comedies, westerns. One night, they showed a newsreel. It was in English, but the images needed no translation. It showed an aircraft factory. The camera panned across an assembly line that seemed a mile long. Dozens of half-built bomber fuselages moved on chains at a steady, relentless pace. At each station, workers, men and women, white and black added a part, tightened a bolt, installed a gun turret. The workers weren't straining. They were performing a calm, practiced dance. At the end of the line, a finished B-17 Flying Fortress, gleaming in silver, was rolled out of the hangar. The title card flashed, "A Bomber an Hour, Willow Run, Michigan." Then the scene cut to a shipyard. The camera shot was from a crane, looking down. The keel of a massive warship lay in a dry dock. Then, through time-lapse photography, the ship grew. Like some terrifying, speeded-up flower, steel plates were swung into place by gargantuan cranes, welded by showers of sparks that looked like fireworks. In a matter of minutes on screen days, in reality a complete aircraft carrier took shape. It was not built, it was assembled. It was an act of creation that bypassed effort and entered the realm of magic. The newsreel cut to a fleet of these carriers, a dozen of them, sailing in formation on a vast, peaceful ocean. An armada that could have ruled the world, produced in a year. In the darkened mess hall, Klaus heard a strangled sound. He looked over. The proud junker was weeping. Silent, shoulder-shaking sobs. He was not crying from fear or self-pity. He was crying from the utter, complete annihilation of a worldview. This was what they had challenged. This was the iceberg their little ideological U-boat had struck. Germany had mustered every ounce of its centuries-old discipline, its philosophical fervor, its martial tradition. America had simply pressed a button on a machine that covered a continent. The war was not a contest. It was a foregone conclusion being mechanically executed. After that night, A strange peace settled over Klaus. The fight was gone. Not the will to live, but the internal war between what he had believed and what he could see. He worked his details, ate his food, wrote letters home filled with hollow reassurance. He watched the American guards, these casual, friendly giants, with a new understanding. They were not supermen. They were not more courageous or inherently better soldiers. They were simply the representatives of a system so vast, so productive, that it could afford to be kind. Its violence was not passionate, it was administrative. Its power was not in its fists, but in its forklifts. The end of the war in Europe came over the camp loudspeakers. There was no jubilation among the prisoners. A profound, weary silence. Some men cried. Most just sat, staring at the ground, the finality of it all washing over them. The camp commandant, a colonel who had always been correct and distant, made a brief announcement. The fighting was over. They would be repatriated, but it would take time. Until then, the routine would continue. On the day Klaus's work detail was sent to help build a new irrigation ditch for a cotton farmer, he saw something that sealed the entire American experience in his mind. The farmer had a new machine, a contraption called a Caterpillar tractor. It was huge, yellow, and diesel-powered. It didn't just pull a plow, it was the plow. With a monstrous blade on the front, it reshaped the earth itself, carving a perfect, graded channel with the ease of a man drawing a line in sand. Klaus leaned on his shovel, watching as the machine did in an hour what would have taken 50 men with picks and shovels a week. The farmer, sitting in the open cab, waved. At that moment, Klaus understood everything. The P-47s that had strafed his column in France, the Sherman tanks that had seemed to multiply like insects, the mountains of supplies, the endless trains, the well-fed guards, the ham sandwiches, they were all symptoms of the same disease. A disease of productivity. A sublime, terrifying mastery of the physical world. Germany had fought with its soul, and its soul had been brave, fierce, and tragic. America fought with its factory floors, and its factory floors were invincible. He would go home eventually, to the rubble and the hunger. He would rebuild a life. But he would carry the secret knowledge with him. That the future belonged not to the side with the strongest will, but to the side with the most seamless concrete, the straightest roads, and the most endless, quiet, overwhelming abundance. The war had been lost the day the first American factory worker, in a clean, well-lit building 10,000 miles from the front, clocked in for his shift. And no one, until now, had even thought to tell the soldiers. The news of the surrender settled over Camp Hearn not like a thunderclap, but like a fine, silent dust. It filtered into the barracks through the crackling loudspeaker, it settled on the shoulders of men as they stood frozen in the middle of sweeping their floors or mending their socks, it filled the vast Texas sky with a new, unanswerable quiet. There was no cheering from the American guards, only a few solemn handshakes and a palpable slackening of tension in their posture. The war was over. They had won. It was a fact, as straightforward and undeniable as the concrete under their feet. For the prisoners, the fact was a void. The thing that had defined every moment of their existence for years, the cause, the enemy, the front, the purpose, however grim, was simply gone. What remained was the camp, the Texas sun, the denim uniforms with their stark PW stamps, and the long, empty road home that no one could yet see. Klaus Vogel stood in the doorway of Barrack 12, watching the evening light stretch the shadows of the guard towers across the manicured lawn. The towers had always been empty, more symbol than threat. Now, they seemed like relics from a dream already fading. Inside, the men were processing the end in their own ways. Young Weber sat on his cot, holding a photograph of his mother and sister from Magdeburg, his shoulders shaking with silent, dry sobs. The haughty Major Schneider, who had wept at the newsreel of the shipyards, now sat at the small plywood table, meticulously folding a letter from his wife into smaller and smaller squares, his face a mask of stone. The ideological arguments, the whispered hopes of a Wunderwaffe turning the tide, the fierce loyalty to a crumbling ideal, all of it had evaporated, leaving behind the raw material of men. Tired, confused, and profoundly homesick for a place that likely no longer existed as they remembered it. The routine didn't change. That was the most disorienting part. The bugle still sounded for reveille. The mess hall still served the staggering portions of stew, potatoes, white bread. The work details still went out to the farms. But the context had been atomized. They were no longer prisoners of war in an ongoing conflict. They were now a logistical problem, a population in transit, a queue waiting to be processed by the same immense machine that had defeated them. The Americans handled this new phase with the same calm, administrative efficiency. There were new forms to fill out. Medical checks intensified, not for fitness to work, but for fitness to travel. Lectures were given now less about camp rules and more about the new Germany and democratic principles. The men listened with a blank, exhausted politeness. Democracy was an abstract concept. A full stomach was not. The sheer, boring benevolence of their captors was, in its own way, more demoralizing than brutality. Brutality you could hate. You could resist it in your soul. This systematic, well-fed waiting room for repatriation offered nothing to push against. It was during this limbo that Klaus experienced the final, and perhaps most intimate, lesson in American might. It wasn't about weapons or factories. It was about a toothache. A dull, persistent throb had started in his lower left jaw, a familiar enough misery from years of poor rations and stress. In Russia, you endured it until it either subsided or exploded into an abscess that a field medic would deal with using pliers and vodka. Here, he mentioned it offhandedly to the medic during a routine check. The response was not a shrug. It was a note on a clipboard. The next morning, his name was called. He was told to report to the camp infirmary. He expected a quick look, perhaps some aspirin. Instead, he was met by a young American Army dentist, Captain Reynolds, who smiled with a practiced ease and gestured to a large, gleaming chair that looked more like a scientific instrument than a piece of furniture. "Hop on up, Klaus. Let's have a look." The use of his first name was still unsettling. The dentist wore a white coat so bright it seemed to generate its own light. The room smelled sharply of antiseptic and peppermint. Captain Reynolds clicked on a powerful, focused light attached to a flexible arm. He peered into Klaus's mouth with a small mirror. "Ah. Molar. Cracked filling. Probably from clenching your jaw. Stress." He said it as if diagnosing a common cold. "We'll take an X-ray to be sure." An X-ray? In a prisoner of war camp? Klaus sat, stunned, as a heavy apron was draped over him and a machine was wheeled over. There was a whir, a click. Minutes later, the dentist was holding up a small, ghostly film to the light, pointing to a dark shadow. "See? Decay under the old work. We'll need to drill it out and refill it. Nasty business, but we'll get you numbed up. You won't feel a thing." What followed was a half-hour of surreal, painless precision. A needle delivered a local anesthetic that worked with shocking speed and completeness. A high-speed drill, its whine unlike any tool Klaus had ever heard, efficiently removed the decay. The dentist hummed as he worked. An assistant passed him instruments. The entire process was clean, quick, and utterly devoid of suffering. When it was over, Captain Reynolds handed Klaus a small packet of aspirin. "Might be a little sore when the Novocaine wears off. Take these if you need them. Try not to chew on that side for a day." Klaus walked out of the infirmary, his tongue probing the smooth, perfect new filling. The sun was blinding. He leaned against the side of the whitewashed building, not from weakness, but from a profound philosophical vertigo. This, he realized, was the ultimate expression of American power. It wasn't just the ability to build a bomber an hour. It was the will, the resources, and the moral confidence to spend time, expertise, and material on the minor comfort of an enemy soldier's tooth. It was power so absolute it could afford to be kind. It could afford to be wasteful with its compassion. In that sterile room, with its humming drill and its concern for his comfort, Klaus felt more thoroughly conquered than he ever had under the guns of AT-34 or in the belly of the sealed Boxcar. They had not just broken his army, they had rendered his entire frame of reference where suffering was a universal currency and hardship a shared condition obsolete. They had fixed his tooth. It was a benevolence that felt like annihilation. The weeks stretched into months. Repatriation was a slow process, bottlenecked by shattered European ports and the monumental task of sorting millions of displaced people. The camp's population began to change. The hardliners, the unrepentant Nazis, were segregated, shipped to more secure facilities for eventual war crimes scrutiny. The rest, the majority like Klaus, were reclassified as low risk. The fences, always more symbolic than real, seemed to fade further into the background. Guards would occasionally take small groups of prisoners on escorted trips, not work details, but visits. To a local high school football game under the Friday night lights, a spectacle of pure, exuberant, meaningless energy that left the Germans baffled and strangely moved. To a town square for an ice cream social, where elderly women served them homemade peach ice cream and asked, with gentle curiosity, about their families over there. On one such trip, to help set up chairs for a church picnic, Klaus struck up a conversation with an older guard named Sergeant Malloy. Malloy was from Pennsylvania, had worked in a steel mill before the war, and had a son who had landed at Omaha Beach. He spoke of his son with a proud, quiet worry. As they stacked folding chairs in a community hall, Malloy pointed to a large, framed photograph on the wall. It showed a bustling factory floor from the turn of the century. "That's the old mill," he said. "Where I started. My pop worked there too." He lit a cigarette, offered one to Klaus. "They shut it down in '31. Depression. Nearly broke us." Klaus took the cigarette, the American tobacco sweet and strong. "That must have been very hard." "Hard." Malloy chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Mister, you don't know the half of it. Soup lines. Selling apples on the corner. Whole country just stopped." He looked out the window at the prosperous, sleepy Texas street. "But you know what? It started back up. Not the same mill. New ones. Bigger. Different. This country. It falls down, it gets back up. It doesn't hold grudges against itself. It just builds the next thing." He looked at Klaus, his eyes clear and direct. "That's what you boys never understood. You thought we were soft because we weren't always screaming about blood and soil. Our soil is blood. And steel. And sweat. But it's also second chances. It's the next thing." The statement lodged in Klaus's mind. It just builds the next thing. That was the essence of it. Germany's power was historical, vertical, digging ever deeper into tradition and discipline and fate. America's power was horizontal, expansive, spreading outwards into the next field, the next machine, the next idea. It was a power of addition, not distillation. It could absorb a depression, a Pearl Harbor, and keep building. It could absorb hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners and fix their teeth. It was relentless not in its fury, but in its forward motion. Finally, the orders came. Barrack 12 was to be shipped out. They were going to a port of embarkation in New Jersey. The process was, again, breathtakingly orderly. They were issued new clothing for the journey: sturdy trousers, wool jackets, sturdy boots. They were given a final medical inspection, a final hot meal. There were no farewell speeches, no ceremonies. They were loaded onto trucks, then onto a passenger train, not a boxcar, but actual coaches with windows that opened and seats with cushions. As the train pulled out of the Texas flatlands, Klaus watched the camp recede, a neat, white geometric arrangement on the endless plain. It looked like a toy. He realized with a start that he would miss it. Not the captivity, but the shocking, challenging piece of it. The impossible clarity it had forced upon him. The train journey east was a 5-day rolling panorama of America's industrial heartland. If Texas had been about agricultural scale, this was about the engine itself. They passed through cities whose skylines were forests of smokestacks, not church spires. The air smelled of coal and ozone. At night, the foundries lit the sky with a permanent orange glow, as if the sun had gotten stuck just below the horizon. The train clattered over bridges that spanned rivers clotted with barges, past junctions where a dozen trains seemed to converge in a ballet of logistics that should have ended in chaos but flowed with smooth, silent efficiency. They saw more goods, more machines, more sheer stuff in a single day than Klaus had seen in his entire life in Germany. It was a panoramic, relentless confirmation of everything he had already learned. It was the theory demonstrated on a continental scale. The final shock was the port. The train delivered them to a vast, marshalling yard outside of New York Harbor. They were transferred to buses. As the bus crested a rise, Klaus saw it. The harbor. It was not a body of water with ships in it. It was a solid plain of ships. Hundreds of them. Freighters, troop ships, tankers, Liberty ships by the dozen, their hulls a uniform gray, packed so tightly the water was almost invisible. Cranes like steel dinosaurs dipped and rose, loading and unloading with a constant, rhythmic motion. The scale was beyond warlike, it was metabolic. This was the system's main artery, and it pulsed with a staggering, uninterrupted volume of life. His mind flashed to the shattered port of Hamburg, where a single sunken freighter could block traffic for weeks. Here, a sunken ship would be a minor nuisance, pushed aside by the next in an endless queue. They boarded a troop ship, the USS General Meigs. It was a converted liner, huge and white, smelling of paint and brine. They were assigned quarters below decks, crowded but clean. As the ship pulled away from the pier, Klaus stood with a crowd of other prisoners at the railing, watching America recede. The skyline of New York City rose in the distance, a jagged, impossible sculpture of arrogance and ambition, the late afternoon sun glinting off a million windows. No bombs had touched it. No fire had scarred it. It stood, whole and towering, a silent testament to a war fought an ocean away. It was the face of the force that had beaten them, distant, untouched, and unimaginably strong. The voyage across the Atlantic was a time of introspection. The ship was a microcosm of the American system, well organized, well fed, monotonously safe. The prisoners kept to themselves, but the old tensions were gone. The war was a closed book. They talked now of home, of family, of trades they might resume. They spoke of Germany with a new, hesitant tenderness, like speaking of a beloved friend who was very ill. Klaus spent hours on deck, watching the endless, empty horizon, feeling the thrum of the ship's engines in the deck beneath his feet. He thought of Sergeant Malloy's words, "It just builds the next thing." What next thing could Germany build from the ashes? Could it learn this other kind of power? Or was it destined forever to be the land of deep, tragic history, forever turning in on itself? Landfall in Europe was a sensory assault in reverse. The port was Bremerhaven, or what was left of it. The smell hit them first, the sour, complex odor of ruin, damp brick dust, stagnant water, untreated sewage, and the faint, ever-present scent of decay. The General Meigs docked amidst a graveyard of sunken, rusting hulls. Cranes were twisted skeletons. Buildings were hollow shells. People moved through the devastation with the slow, deliberate movements of the deeply weary. The color was gone, washed out into a universal gray-brown. The transition from the clean, well-lit world of the troop ship to this landscape of wreckage was physically painful. The prisoners disembarked, their American-issued boots sounding too loud on the broken concrete. They were processed by British military police, their names checked against lists. The efficiency was still there, but it was a grim, exhausted efficiency. They were given a thin blanket and a ration card. The food was a watery soup and a piece of hard, dark bread. The coffee was ersatz. The shock of return was profound. It wasn't just poverty, it was the crushing weight of defeat made manifest in every cracked stone, in every hungry face. Klaus made his way home to Hamburg. The journey was a pilgrimage through a nightmare. Cities were not just damaged, they were erased. Familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by chaotic mountains of rubble. Trains ran sporadically, overcrowded with silent, hollow-eyed people. He walked the final miles from a bombed-out station. His street was there, but his house was not. A neighbor, an old woman he barely recognized, told him his mother and sister had died in the firestorm of '43. She pointed him to a temporary shelter where his father, broken by emphysema and grief, was living. The reunion was quiet, drained of drama by the sheer scale of the surrounding loss. His father, a shriveled ghost of the stern shipyard foreman he remembered, clutched his hand and cried soundlessly. They had nothing. The currency was cigarettes, the black market was king, and hope was a carefully guarded, precious commodity. Klaus dug through the rubble of their home with other returning men, salvaging bricks, one by one, to sell for food. The work was backbreaking, primitive. It was the absolute antithesis of the caterpillar tractor carving the irrigation ditch. In the crushing reality of the Trümmerfrau existence, the memory of America began to feel like a hallucination. The endless food, the hot showers, the miraculous dentistry, the wide, straight roads, it all seemed like a dream from another planet, a cruel, beautiful fantasy. Yet, it was the memory of that fantasy that kept him from despair. He had seen the other side of the coin. He knew that the wreckage around him was not the natural state of the world. It was a condition, and conditions could change. America had proven that on a scale that left no room for doubt. He found work, eventually, clearing rubble for the British occupation authorities. The pay was meager, but it was food. One day, a British Army engineer, a captain with a clipboard, approached him and a few other men. He spoke in halting German. They were to clear a specific area for a new construction. Not a building, but a road. The engineer unrolled a blueprint. It showed a wide, curving avenue. Klaus looked at the plans, at the clean lines, the specified grades. It was a tiny, nascent piece of the American geometry, transplanted onto the corpse of his city. As he swung his pickaxe into the packed debris, the irony was a physical taste in his mouth. He was now part of the manual labor, the human muscle, that stood in stark contrast to the machine power he had witnessed. Yet, the blueprint was the promise. The will to make the straight road, to impose order on the chaos, was the first seed of the next thing. He worked with a new kind of patience. He was no longer just clearing rubble, he was clearing space for what might come. Years passed. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, began. At first, it was just more food, then a trickle of consumer goods. One day, walking to his job at a new factory being built on the edge of the city, a factory financed by American dollars, he saw a sight that stopped him dead. Parked on a newly paved street was a car. It was a Volkswagen Beetle, shiny and new. And next to it, unloading crates from a truck, was a man in workman's clothes. The man finished, got into the Beetle, and drove away. A worker with a car. The image from the Texas roadside, the one that had so shocked him, was recreating itself here, in Hamburg. The infection of abundance was spreading. Klaus never spoke much about his time in America. It was too strange, too alien, too easily misinterpreted as boasting or worse, a lack of loyalty to the suffering of his own people. But he carried the knowledge within him like a secret engine. When he saw the first Marshall Plan shipments of grain, he understood the strategy not as charity, but as a continuation of the same productive logic that had won the war: create stability, create markets, build the next thing. When German factories began to retool, not for tanks but for refrigerators and cars, he saw not a fall from martial grace, but an embrace of a more formidable power. In his later years, retired, watching his grandchildren grow up in a prosperous, peaceful Germany that was a linchpin of a new Europe, Klaus would sometimes sit in his small, tidy garden. The memory of Camp Herne would surface, not as a memory of captivity, but as a memory of a terrifying education. They had been shocked by America's industrial might not because it was fearsome, but because it was so utterly, calmly normal. It was the future, happening without drama or fanfare, in the broad daylight of a Texas afternoon. The war had simply been the moment the future introduced itself, with a ham sandwich in one hand and a drill for a toothache in the other. The laughter of the German pilots at the P-47 had been the last, desperate chuckle of the old world. The silence that followed was the sound of the new world arriving. And he, Klaus Vogel, a simple Feldwebel from Hamburg, had had a front row seat. He had been defeated, yes. But more importantly, he had been shown. And in the end, for the ones who survived, being shown the truth was the only victory that mattered. The train Klaus Vogel watched from his Hamburg garden was not the train of memory. It was not a sealed boxcar, nor a troop transport. It was a sleek, silver intercity express, gliding silently on welded rails, a whisper of precision engineering. It carried business people and tourists, not prisoners or soldiers. It moved through a landscape not of ruin, but of orderly suburbs and restored forests, a testament to a meticulous, patient rebuilding. He watched it vanish into the green distance, its passing marked only by a soft rush of air and the lingering hum of progress. The arc was complete. From the stunned silence of a Texas rail yard to this quiet garden in a nation reborn, the journey had spanned not just miles, but mental continents. The shock of America's might was not a single event, it was a slow drip revelation, a rewiring of a fundamental understanding of what power was. It had begun with concrete and ended with cognition. For Klaus, and for the hundreds of thousands like him, the true capture happened not at the front, but in the camp canteen, in the dentist's chair, in the farmer's field. The war had been lost with bullets and bombs. But the peace the future was won with stew and sandwiches, with Novocaine and nylon stockings on PX shelves, with the sheer, unanswerable logic of a system that could afford to be kind. The Germans had fought with the desperate, focused intensity of a master craftsman. They were defeated by the indifferent, boundless energy of an assembly line. It was a clash not of courage, but of concepts. The legacy of that shock rippled through the decades. The men who returned from American captivity carried a silent, subversive knowledge back into the rubble. They had seen the other side of scarcity. They knew that hunger was not a law of nature, but a failure of logistics. That destruction was not an end, but a prelude to a different kind of construction. They were the unknowing vectors of a new idea, that security lay not in fortresses, but in food security, that national strength was measured not in divisions, but in diesel horsepower and distribution networks. When the Marshall Plan poured American capital into the shattered veins of Europe, it was not seen by these men as charity from a victor, but as the inevitable export of the system they had witnessed. The Wirtschaftswunder wonder was not a miracle. It was an application of principles observed in a prisoner of war camp in Texas: efficiency, standardization, scale, and a focus on consumer abundance as the ultimate foundation of stability. The Volkswagen Beetle parked on a Hamburg street was the direct ideological descendant of the Ford truck in the Texas field. It was the next thing being built. The documentary of that experience is not written in official histories. It is etched in the quiet moments of men like Klaus, in the way they valued education for their children, not just in the classics, but in engineering and business. It is in their deep, sometimes uneasy, embrace of a new European identity built on economic integration, a peace forged not from shared blood, but from shared steel coils and automotive supply chains. The trauma of the war bred a profound allergy to the old, romantic nationalism that had led to the abyss. The shock of American abundance pointed toward a different, pragmatic path. So, as the sleek modern train disappears, the final image is not of triumph or defeat, but of synthesis. The German prisoner, once shocked by the Caterpillar tractor's power, retired from a factory that built machines just like it. The American Guard's casual confidence evolved into the framework for a transatlantic alliance. The flying barrel that silenced laughter in the sky became a symbol of a partnership that now patrols those same skies together. The ultimate victory of America's industrial might was not that it conquered Germany, but that it convinced it. It convinced a generation that the future lay in building, not in destroying, in filling shelves, not in holding lines, in fixing teeth, not in breaking bones. The shock wore off, replaced by a sober, determined emulation. The prisoner of war camps were temporary. The lesson they imparted was permanent. Klaus rises from his garden chair, the ghost of a Texas sun still warm on his skin, a memory now 70 years old. He goes inside to a warm, lit house, to a family shaped by peace. The silence around him is not the silence of the boxcar, nor the stunned silence of the newsreel audience. It is the quiet hum of a normal life, in a normal country, the most shocking, and most precious, outcome of all. The war ended with a signature on a document. But the real peace treaty was signed every day in 1,000 small acts of reconstruction. By men who had learned, in the most startling classroom imaginable, that the most formidable force on earth is not the will to die for a cause, but the relentless, boring, magnificent will to provide. The final, closing truth of the documentary is this: they were not shocked by America's power to make war. They were shattered by its awesome, terrifying, and ultimately contagious power to make everything else. The echo of that revelation is the world we live in now.